Welcome back, everyone, to the second session on the space debris of the UN Portugal Policy Symposium, preparatory of the high-level conference on management and sustainability of outer space activities. As you all know, we've had an earlier session at 8 o'clock UTC led by Dr. Umama Weshwaran, and the outcomes were quite nice, such as on-orbit servicing on debris removal and the trusts and the development of the state-of-the-art technical practices that can enable best practices, guidelines, or norms. The call regarding space debris falling on Earth and the related action protocols. The importance of self-abiding policies and regulations aims to mitigation and remediation at a zero debris result. The importance of the development of norms to minimize the actual threat that space debris poses and the urgent need to mitigation and incorporation of these concerns as soon as in the design phase, and the inherent merits for the companies to develop all these best practices and the creation of sustainability ratings. It was clear that we still had much to talk about and that one session clearly was not enough. We already sensed that, so we've had to have another session and had to invite Niklas Hedman to moderate it. Mr. Hedman was acting director of the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs before retiring from the United Nations last year. He served for 18 years as chief of the Committee Policy and Legal Affairs section of the committee, where he served as secretary of COPUS and Scientific and Technical Subcommittee and Subcommittee. Dear Niklas, thank you so much for finding the time and the means to accommodate the moderation of this session. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Thank you indeed. And I also welcome the panelists. And just for all the attendance, I will introduce each of the panelists right before their respective speaking slots and presentations. Carolina made just a quick review of the findings of the panel we heard this morning, and I followed the panel, and it was very interesting. Also from the perspective of the diversity of the panel itself, and we see that also in this afternoon panel. So in the morning, there were representatives from National Space Agency, also from non-governmental organizations, and from private sector. And this afternoon, we also have a private sector, we have international intergovernmental organization presence, we have National Space Agency and academia. So I think it gives also a broad, I would say, framework to the discussions we will have on space debris. Before I open the panel discussion, I would like to make just a very, very brief note. As we all know, the webinar that we have now this week is following on to the technical webinar that was held late last year. And both those webinars, online webinars, will feed into the on-site conference in Portugal, I think in May this year. And you should all have the outputs, the report from the technical webinar that was held late 2023, but I would like to just make a very, very quick overview of the recommendations and outputs, particularly on space debris, since this is what we are tasked to discuss today. So there were mainly 4 points that were really pushed on as kind of recommendations, or I would say outputs from the space debris discussions at the technical seminar. And the most important was that we all need to ensure that what is launched into space would be brought down to Earth. So we talk here about post-mission disposal. And of course, there is a lot to be discussed on the success rates in that and improvements, etc. But that was really one of the most important factors. A second point was, of course, the need for regulatory frameworks at the national level, and if possible, I would say a stronger harmonization between the different national regulatory frameworks, so that everyone pushes in the same direction, in a sense, and obviously also leading then to international coordination, where the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPUS, has a very important prominent role, not least through its working group on long-term sustainability. And we had the benefit this morning of seeing the chair of the LTS working group moderating the panel, Mr. Uma Maheshwaran R. The third point is quite complicated, and that relates to the tracking of objects, and particularly tracking of objects that are not yet catalogued, and all the issues and challenges in that regard. And the question is whether what we can do at the international level in terms of data and tracking abilities, and particularly in coordinating the data that states and other actors already have. Access to data, profoundly important, not least for the global community, where we have major spacefaring nations and emerging spacefaring nations needing this data. And then, of course, the last point, and that is the one moving forward in the future, active debris removal, where we only are in, I would say, in the pre-phase, but this is a topic that really is needed to be tackled and be brought to the table, not least of COPUS in the coming period. And this leads me actually to the whole foundation for those webinars and the Portugal conference, to feed in to the Summit of the Future, to see how we can deal with the Secretary General policy brief on outer space, and how to stimulate the international community, predominantly COPUS, in the areas of space traffic management, space debris removal, and space resource activities. 3 areas, 3 pillars that have an interrelationship, as we know. So that was just what I wanted to say as a kind of a trigger. And I would now call upon our first panelist, and that is Vini Aloia, who is the head of legal, regulatory affairs and space policy at Astroscale, and where he oversees all legal affairs activities, for instance, space system licensing, but also the management of access to the radio spectrum. And he's also overseeing space policy initiatives of Astroscale. Before Astroscale, he was legal and regulatory officer at iSpace Europe, and he was also legal counsel at SES. Vini, you have the floor, please.
All right. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. So thank you, Niklas, for the very kind introduction. So I'd like to start by thanking and congratulating the organizers, so the Office of Aerospace Affairs and the Portuguese Space Agency, for organizing this event, and also for the UK Space Agency for nominating me to join this panel today. And also, I'd like to use this opportunity to congratulate Portugal and the Portuguese Space Agency and ANACOM, who is the space activities regulator in Portugal, for issuing the first operator's license on the 5th of May. So very nice, and very nicely linked with what we are going to discuss here today. So let me very quickly share my screen. Barring any technical difficulties, can you please confirm that you can see my slides?
Yes, we can see the slides.
All right, wonderful. Niklas, please keep me honest here in relation to time, and feel free to interrupt me if I'm exceeding my allocated time. So we can start by essentially reminding yourselves of something that most of us are already very familiar with. Since Sputnik launched in 1957, humans have been launching objects into space. There is an increased number of objects being launched every year, exponentially, and orbits are already hazardous due to space debris. So more than 36,000 objects larger than 10 centimeters, only roughly a bit over 6,000 of them are still active satellites. So collisions can produce large quantities of orbital debris that remain a threat to decades or centuries, and even very small debris can destroy or seriously damage active satellites or endanger, for instance, crew, space stations in orbit, etc. So here we can see the exponential growth on the number of tracked objects, and you can see some spikes in this chart, and this is related to the anti-satellite tests that we had, which are also very, very concerning. So moving on quickly, here is a very interesting picture. I believe the one on the left is located at ISOC in Germany, but it's a representation of how very small pieces of debris can be absolutely catastrophic. So on the left, again, is a picture of a 1 centimeter aluminium sphere hitting a 13 centimeter thick aluminium plate at about 7 kilometers per second. So that is roughly 28,000 kilometers per hour. And on the right is a picture taken by the astronaut T-Peak, the UK astronaut T-Peak, of a chip that appeared on the ISS window. We believe that this was possibly caused by a paint flake or small metal fragment no bigger than a few thousandth of a millimeter across. So it's a good representation of how serious the problem of space debris is. Very briefly about Astroscale as a company. So we were founded about 10 years ago by our founder, Nobu Okada, and led by a clear opportunity to address the issue of space debris and long-term sustainability of space activities. And we have as our mission the safe and sustainable development of space for the benefit of future generations, and as a mission to develop these innovative technologies, advance the business cases, and inform international policies to reduce orbital debris and support long-term sustainable use of space. More specifically about what we've been working on in the past few years, we are developing market-leading rendezvous and proximity operations, and those include end-of-life services and active debris removal. So those are the activities that we primarily focus here in the UK. Life extension services, which is primarily being developed by our colleagues in the US and Israel. In-space situational awareness, so to inspect, diagnose, characterize space objects in space, and that links very nicely to what my colleague Aya from Astroscale Japan talked about in the session earlier today, and also exploring RPO expertise and technical capabilities to provide defense-specific services and space domain awareness. Here is an overview of some of our upcoming missions and existing missions. So we do have an object in orbit, so it's called ELSA-D, so End of Life Services by Astroscale demonstration mission. We are successfully deorbiting ELSA-D now, and we are sticking voluntarily to the 5 years post-mission disposal, even though it's not a regulatory requirement here in the UK. We launched about a couple of weeks ago ADRAS-J, so that's an active debris removal mission. So ADRAS-J1 is actually an inspection mission financed by JAXA and the Japanese government. And this mission is inspecting the second stage of a JAXA launcher, and ADRAS-J2 will go up there and remove this object. ELSA-M, which is our commercial end-of-life services by Astroscale, we expect to launch by the end of 2025, early 2026. This is part of the Sunrise program with ESA and OneWeb. LEXI-R, which is a life extension mission. COSMIC, which is the UK ADR mission that we are in a healthy competition with our colleagues from ClearSpace, and very nice to see Romain from ClearSpace joining us here today in this panel. And ADRAS-J2, as I mentioned before, is the mission that is going to remove that large piece of space debris. And in relation to our global footprint, we have a presence in pretty much every continent. So we are based here in the UK, but headquartered in Japan. We've recently opened our offices in France and offices in the US, Israel, and Singapore. We have 500 employees, 7 offices, and over. This number is slightly outdated, but over $400 million raised in funding so far. Now, very briefly to what we have been doing in terms of regulatory affairs and space policy. So we contribute to the development of global best practices, norms, and guidelines for space sustainability. So here we can see some examples of the fora that we join and some of the activities that we do. So we work very closely, for instance, with the ITU as a sector member of the ITU. So we were directly involved in the drafting of resolution 74 that came out of the Radio Communication Assembly last year in Dubai. And that is a very good resolution that arose in response to resolution 219 on space sustainability, and it calls the study groups to investigate methodologies for disposal and deorbit of space objects, and possibly a recommendation in that regard. We work with academia, industry groups, including Converse, Space Safety Coalition, the Global Satellite Operators Association, GSOA, several governments, space agencies and intergovernmental organizations, so ESA, UK Space Agency, more recently CNES, NASA, JAXA. And we were directly and indirectly responsible for the drafting of several non-legally binding instruments for the remediation of space debris, including the Space Safety Coalition best practices, WEF Space Industry Space Debris Mitigation, Zero Debris Charter, GSOA Code of Conduct, just to name a few. Here is a visual representation of our so-called policy chain and how these policy activities may affect and impact the shaping of national and global policy. So starting with thought leadership, so engaging and participating in events such as this one, where we were kindly invited. So sharing our experience with these missions and activities, and learning and contributing to the development of these new policies, joining in industry and multilateral best practices, influencing as much as possible and providing inputs for the development of technical standards. So that is reflected in ISO standards, that is reflected in the works that are being done now for the shaping of the EU space law, which aims to harmonize technical standards for resilience, security and sustainability across the single market, domestic regulations. So we are joining the DC, the Department of Science and Technology here in the UK, as part of the regulatory review. So looking at the applicable primary legislation regulation and identifying all possible gaps. Ofcom, FCC, CA, etc. That ends up being reflected in national policy and strategy. Recently, about actually a couple of days ago, the UK published its space industrial plan, and we have as 2 out of 5 pillars at that industrial plan the development of space domain awareness and in-orbit servicing, assembly and manufacturing. So that is a direct reflection of a lot of the work that we do with UK government. National legislation, multilateral and international agreements, and ITU work is also a reflection of that. So here just, again, a few examples of how we work with governments and organizations across the world, supporting here in the UK government, participating in consultations that incentivize and encourage the adoption of more sustainable practices, working with France and the European Union, with ESA. So we participated in the drafting of the new ESA space debris mitigation standards, Zero Debris Charter, and also other Japanese and US initiatives. I'm almost done. So here is just an example of some of the regulatory and policy recommendations that we might come across coming out of Astroscale. We are constantly reviewing a lot of these policy recommendations, and they all have as core principles aspects related to safety, security, sustainability, responsibility. So here we have, for instance, post-mission disposal timeframe, so sticking to 5 years or less than 5 years for little spacecraft, and different rates and reliability rates for large constellations, for example. That is reflected in the charter, the Zero Debris Charter, for example. Maneuverability above certain orbits, particularly the orbits of cruise space stations, the importance of having propulsion or otherwise having those spacecraft maneuverable to avoid collisions. Collision risk, the way to calculate collision risk, possibly using an aggregate probability of collision for large constellations. Remediation, so adopting in-orbit servicing and active debris removal, and acknowledging and recognizing that IOS and ADR is part of a set of proposed solutions for long-term sustainability. Is not in itself going to solve the problem, but it's part of the puzzle. It's part of the equation. Financial and other kinds of incentives. So a lot of these voluntary instruments that are being proposed or being developed is important for states and intergovernmental organizations to have the appropriate incentives so operators can adopt more sustainable practices. And this can be reflected, for instance, in capping third-party liability insurance, indemnification from governments, and other kinds of financial insurance, for instance, financial incentives, for instance, in relation to insurance, government bonds, etc. And measures such as market access and spectrum access. So in places whereby you require your operator's license separate from your spectrum license, if you're seeking market access in a different jurisdiction, to make sure that access to spectrum, that market access is linked to sustainable practices, and also export control and understanding how Niklas mentioned, for instance, data. So how understanding how we can share this data across entities and across governments is also very, very important. Now, again, just to conclude, this also...
We're running out of time, so just wrap up.
Yes. So just to wrap up, one last slide. These are some of the policy issues, but we also have some legal issues and issues related to international space law. And just to name a few, we've been working with all these governments that in the jurisdictions we operate from in obtaining clarification to simplify and enable these missions to take place to ensure long-term sustainability. And those include identifying the appropriate state, which are authorized and supervised, international liability, so issues such as identifying the launching state, clarifying how states interpret certain international obligations, such as what does it mean to procure the launching of a spacecraft to identify the launching state and ultimately which state is liable in case of damage. Jurisdiction and control. So what does control is supposed to be? I know a lot of academics watching now have explored how to interpret and define control. Is it effective control? Is it jurisdictional control? Consent, transparency. What consent we need to obtain from the operator, owner, a licensing state, launching state. Transparency is very important. So we are carrying out our missions now. To what degree transparency is expected, and contracting mechanisms and export control and APR considerations are also something that is crucial for us to obtain clarification as much as possible. So that was as brief as possible overview of Astroscale and what we do and some of the challenges regarding policy and law and international space law that can contribute to enabling sustainability and tackling the issue of space debris. So thank you very much, and looking forward to the other panelists and the discussions.
Thank you very much, Vini, for that presentation. Great. So we move on right away to our next speaker, which is Aurelie Trur.
Hello.
Yes, hello. She's an independent global space policy expert with many years' involvement with the space community, particularly between France and Turkey. Recently, she was invited to head a new space diplomacy project at the Foreign Policy Institute of Ankara. Aurelie, please, you have the floor.
Can everyone hear me well? Yes. So because we need to catch up on the time, I won't share any slides right now. So let me just briefly, firstly, thank you for having me, the Portuguese Space Agency and UNOSA. Let me introduce what happens in Turkey, where I've been based in the past few years, is that they have been launching their first astronaut, the first Turkish astronaut. And this has generated a larger interest for the government to get involved with space policy initiatives. And so I have proposed with the think tank based in the capital city that we should really get more involved. So this is a bit of the background. And as regards our meeting today, the discussion about the semester of the future, what I would like to address, if we just have a few minutes, is about the priorities on debris removal and the resources beyond the near-Earth space. And I would like to note that following my research, my doctoral research was on the space debris governance, and I used the space debris governance evaluation and history as the lessons learned in terms of governance. So I was looking into which are the platforms where the space debris instruments have been emerging. So the Interagency Debris Committee, the IADC, the discussions at COPUS, and I looked at some basic elements which were present already in the existing space law, the regime. And then I looked at the evolution, and in the end it was very clear that we have some policy innovation with the industry really joining industry associations, which Mr. Aloia Mr. Vini was really presenting some best case practices from his company that he represents. So he offered a really good reminder about these facts, that the governance in space sustainability has the innovative ways to involve the industry and catch up with the policy gaps at the international level. So we do not have an international space government or in an international space agency yet. But we have the UN COPUS committee and the discussions there. And I view the LTS guidelines, long-term sustainability guidelines, as the really kind of the treaty replacement for space sustainability, more as the most recent progress. And if I take the comparison with my doctoral research, I would like to acknowledge the good news that I find, that the all work that has taken decades to shape up the LTS guidelines, the ideas about the removal and the resources on beyond the near Earth. So we are talking about the moon and cislunar space. The space debris protection ideas are there. So the Artemis Accord have included a provision about avoiding to create space debris around of the moon and on the moon. And there have been some Moon Village Association best practices agreements in the past years. So we are seeing the continuation of the same trends of space sustainability governance, where there is a much larger number of stakeholder participation, including industry association, including academia, and including the governmental entities such as space agencies and also UN bodies, like we also mentioned just before, ITU. So we are really seeing the common collective space debris and space sustainability governance progress. So that would be what I take as what we have achieved so far, is that for the common future and the pact that we are trying to shape, it's good to acknowledge the progress and to consolidate on that, on what we have already commonly shaped. If I can be as quick as possible.
Thank you very much. Great. I think we move on to the next speaker straight away. And this is Ms. Fatheya Al Sharji, who is the legal principal researcher at the UAE Space Agency. She has contributed to critical projects such as the UAE Space Law on regulating space activities and its related regulations. She has also conducted important research on space traffic management and space debris mitigation. Fatheya, you have the floor.
Thank you, Niklas, for the introduction, and thank you for the organizers for having us and for organizing such events. I think I have a presentation. Should I share my screen, or you guys will pull it?
Yes, please. If you're not able to, then we will screen it. But if you could, that will be desirable. Thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So I'll be talking briefly about the approach of United Arab Emirates regarding the space debris mitigation. So through my presentation, I will just touch on our UAE space law, the updated ones, 2023. And we have also our space debris mitigation guideline, which was issued in 2022. And I'll be talking about its scope, purpose, and finally the obligation of the operators or the applicant. I mean by the applicant, anyone who applies for an authorization in the UAE. Under the federal law, the operator is obligated to take all necessary measures and plans to mitigate space debris and reduce its effects. He also is obligated to notify the UAE Space Agency immediately if there is any creation of space debris from his space object, if he exposed to a high risk such as loss of control of his space object or collision with the space debris or any other space object. He also needs to notify the UAE about any measures and plans that he took to mitigate such risks and any modification to such plans and measures. Space debris mitigation guideline, as I said, it was issued in 2022. Under all the space activities and other activities related to the space sectors that are under the scope of the UAE regulations, I mean under the UAE law, space law and regulation will fall down. Will be covered in this guidelines, as well as all the subjects, all the space objects that are authorized from the UAE or registered in the UAE National Registry of Space Objects. The guidelines have many aims, such as reduce the creation of new space debris in the space in outer space, ensure that the UAE is in conformity with its international obligations, international law, and international or best standards and best practices. The guidelines also promote the long-term sustainability of outer space for peaceful purposes and the benefit of all mankind. Under the guidelines, operator is obligated to many things. First, the guidelines should be taken into consideration when in all the space object life cycle, including launch, operation, disposal, as well as the design. A space debris mitigation plan should be submitted, which has two components. One is risk assessment, where the operator needs to submit the risks, the risk that's associated with his space, his space activity, and the implementation plan, how he can overcome such risks in detail. The operator also may take a space in his space debris mitigation plan, take all the international standards and measures, such as the ISO recommendations, IADC guidelines, UN space debris mitigation. In section 7 of our guideline, we have a set of recommendations and they are not mandatory for the operator, where the operator can choose between taking one of these international standards and best practices or these recommendations, or if he decided not to take either one. He need just to notify the UAE Space Agency about the reasons that he can't take any of these measures, and it will be something for the UAE Space Agency to look at and get back to him. The operator is obligated to provide the agency with the 3 reports: pre-launch report before the launch, and post-launch report after the launch, and then the space object end of life report. The operator is obligated overall to immediately notify the UAE Space Agency in the end of the functional use of the space object, disposal or re-entry, in case where any accident or incident occurred to his space object, in case of his space object created any debris, or in case of his space object is exposed to any high risk, including loss of control, collision with other space object or a debris in the space in the outer space. And finally, the operator is obligated to submit an annual report to the UAE Space Agency about the status of his authorized activity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Great. We move on our list, and the next speaker is Tiago Soares, who is the ESA ClearSpace Office Lead Engineer, and lately he has also been leading the technical aspects of the zero debris approach of ESA, helping define ESA policy and the Zero Debris Charter. He was one of the founders of the ClearSpace initiative. Tiago, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So, good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank, of course, the Portuguese Space Agency and the UN Corpus for this invitation. I had the pleasure to be already in the technical session, and thanks to open the floor again to discuss this topic here in the policy aspects. So I'll just try to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see.
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. Of course, it goes on the wrong side. Just a second. Okay, so I'll start to say that I've been working now on ClearSpace for about 12 years. So this was an initiative that ESA has put forward already in 2012, when we knew that the requirements that were being applied to our missions, first to our missions in general, to the space sector, first were not already enough with the traffic we had at the time, but were also not being implemented to the extent they should be. So we were falling behind in 2 aspects, right? And we are seeing this very clearly in the exponential growth that Vini could show before. No, notwithstanding this, we actually see in the last years a very, very high and steep increase in the use of space, many new actors coming in, which makes these previous targets and requirements even more outdated, let's say, with respect to what is needed for space sustainability. So what I'm going to present here to you is also what I think is a good example of what agencies can do in a proactive way. We had the chance to have also a clear support, not only from our management. As you can see, our Director General is very implicated in promoting what he called the zero debris approach. And even to put ESA forward, saying we want to lead by example, and here is where I think agencies have a big role to play in being proactive. But this was also endorsed by our member states in the last ministerial conference that we had in 22, and also opening the floor not only to implement this approach as at ESA and to lead by example as an agency, but also to encourage other actors to do the same. And this is what I'm going to present to you, how we are trying to get about this mandate. So we have inside ESA our own, what we call the ESA, the zero debris approach. So we started developing technical standards and policy for our own missions, so for ESA missions. That is already doing its first steps. And actually we had, as I'll show to you, technical standard that was published last year that is now applicable to all ESA missions. So ESA is doing and moving on its own missions, but also he started facilitating a process to bring several actors together, space agencies, meaning national agencies, but also international agencies. We had industry, we had operators, we had space surveillance actors involved in developing a charter that I'll explain to you what it contains and what it consists of, but that really tries to set the scene and do something new with actual targets for the long-term sustainability of space. And finally, I'll also introduce to you the step where we are now, because we really try with this new approach. And again, I think it's a role that agencies can play to break this loop of technology not be ready because there's no demand from regulation, and regulation not moving because the technology is not there. So this is really how we try to tackle this issue. And it can also only be done, of course, by uniting the community around certain objectives. So we have seen just before how different agencies and industry are promoting good practices. So in ESA, and you will find in the slides that I'm showing a few QR codes that you can use if you're more interested in going into more detail on what the different elements are. We have worked during the whole last year in preparing a standard, as I say, with a very extensive list of design and operations requirements that are now applicable to our missions. This is really a state-of-the-art standard that is then put into force by an internal policy in ESA that basically pushes this standard to be used not only inside ESA, but when we are in cooperation with partners to have ESA promoting the use of this standard. Of course, then is a discussion with the partner, but as far as ESA is concerned, we want to apply it to all our missions in cooperation or not. Then if we go to the Zero Debris Charter, I think this was a major development of last year. As far as I know, it's still the only document that really tries to put forward some clear and measurable targets that we want to reach in the next year, so by 2030. That would ensure, let's say, a major step towards space sustainability. Unfortunately, as you could see in my first slide, we know that today it's impossible in a way to contain the proliferation of debris in terms of numbers. The numbers that are today in space will already keep growing due to collisions, but we need to bring it down and to keep the risk as limited as possible and as fixed as possible to the risk we have now, not to jeopardize our future missions. So we try to define clear numbers, clear targets that can drive this. This has been done together with about 30 active participant organizations, but there are more than 100 that were following the process. And today this charter will be, there's already more than 100 organizations lining up to sign it and to be part of this charter. It's a non-binding document, it's a volunteer participation document, but that really tries to federate and to promote collaborative capacity building. You can see here a number of events that are foreseen for this year. In particular, already on the 4th of April, there will be a ESA ESTSL co-organized symposium as well to go deeper into how these targets and the charter can also support future regulation among our member states and other entities. Then finally, I want to bring to your attention the work we are doing right now. There's a number of workshops coming also on this. That is called the Zero Debris Technical Booklet. Here, as I say, we try to use the current regulatory framework and the ones that are under development, together with this more far-reaching objectives that we have in the charter, to put together a portfolio of technical solutions that need to be developed in order to reach this more sustainable use of space. And that's what we are trying to collect in this document. Everybody is welcome to join this effort as for the charter, so don't hesitate to register if you want to have access to the draft that we have right now and to participate in the elaboration of the final issue of this document that will be, again, a supporting document on how we can progress technically together to support the evolution of the current regulation and make sure that space is used sustainably in the future. So these were the slides I wanted to share, and be happy to discuss it afterwards.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you. And we move on to the last speaker, who is Mr. Romain Buchs, who works on space policy and strategy at ClearSpace. He leads strategic policy initiatives and regulatory activities across ClearSpace's missions. He coordinates ClearSpace's policy efforts to make space activities safer and more sustainable, and he supports decision-making in strategic domains of ClearSpace. So, Romain, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Niklas, for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you for the organizer. It's been a great presentation so far. I've tried to add to what's been said and try not to repeat too much. I'm gonna just share my screen. So in this introductory remarks, I'd like to give you a quick view of what ClearSpace is about and how we are step by step building a circular space economy, which is needed to address the space debris issue. As it's been said already before, the amount of space debris in Earth orbit has been growing dramatically. And there's been quite a focus on the growth of the space debris in orbit, but what is also very important to note is how societies are getting more and more reliant on space infrastructures, meaning that not only the probability of something bad happening is growing, but the consequences of it, meaning that overall, in a way, the risk associated to our space infrastructure due to space debris is growing. And that's what ClearSpace is trying to address by developing services in orbit. Because at the heart of the issue of space debris is the way we envision space missions. We launch, use, and then discard. That means we need to change the way of planning, designing, and operating space mission to limit the problem on the long term. And to do that, we need in-orbit services. We need to be able to maintain the infrastructure and do more with it. So we are starting with the first service, that is removing the junk. The first thing to do is make sure what we have up there can be removed. Then we can try and do more and extend the life of assets, for example, or refuel them. And step by step, we can do more towards a circular space economy. And the capabilities developed to provide one service are helpful for other services. Once you're able to dock to a client satellite or capture a client satellite, you can start providing services. You can start moving parts, repairing, and move towards recycling. And so the first part of this, which we started, is about removing derelict objects and satellites at their end of life. We are actively working on 3 missions. The first one's called ClearSpace 1, which you see here on the left. It's been commissioned by the European Space Agency and is aimed at removing a derelict object that has been in space for more than 10 years and is owned by the agency, and demonstrating the full value chain of a debris removal mission, where a large object is picked and its altitude reduced such that it can safely burn into the atmosphere and reduce risk on orbit. The second mission we've been actively working on is CLEAR, that is led from the UK, where here we go one step further and try and remove more than one piece of debris and reuse the services satellite to do more. The only way to provide affordable services in the long term is to be able to reuse the services satellite that is able to do multiple services, either multiple debris removal or maybe one day multiple different services with the same services satellite. This is currently under a Phase B contract from the UKSA, and here we really aim at removing 2 UK licensed objects. In the last mission, which is called Anchor, we're talking about extending the life of satellites. Large, expensive satellites, such as communication satellites in geo orbit, have usually are often perfectly functioning at their planned end of life, but have limited fuel or propellant to stay in their slots. So they're deorbited, although they're perfectly functional. And so the idea here is to extend their life, to keep using these assets for longer. As this is not easy to refuel them, you're piggybacking and being a kind of a backpack that do the maneuvers for the client satellite. So this was kind of a short overview of the different missions ClearSpace is involved with, but I'd like to discuss a bit the overall approach to policy in this frame, because it's mostly the discussion we want to get involved with today. And Vini showed kind of a chain, and I'm going to show a pyramid, but these are a lot of the same things here on how these governance of space activities address safety and sustainability. At the top, you have the only legally binding instruments, the UN treaties. These are the only things that are binding, and as mentioned before, they're vague, and they were designed to be vague to accommodate a lot of activities, and they're completed by other instruments that are non-legally binding at the UN level. There's then also international standards that have been mentioned, developed by ISO, the IADC, other organizations, that can become binding through licensing, but they're not per se binding on everyone. Then there's 2 levels that are very interesting for us, because most space mission will have to go through one of those. The one is either government programs, which have their own rules, such as the new rules ESA is applying to its space missions, that are mandatory for their programs. And then there's the licensing, to which most commercial entities in most countries that have a regulatory frameworks developed will need to abide by. And finally, there's the industry best practices that are also completing the picture of the guidelines and ways of addressing space debris. What is very important to note here is that this does not flow from the top to the bottom, but there's a lot of activities from the bottom that will influence, for example, the development of international standards that are then picked by regulators and used in licensing. One key aspect here to remember is that all this has been focusing mostly on space debris mitigation. Remediation has not really been dealt with in policies. There's no really instruments to address the legacy objects, everything that we've left in orbit. Things are moving, and there's been a lot of development in those 3 levels, national policies, licensing, and industry best practices. For example, to try and have requirements on preparing satellites for servicing to enable these activities, but they're not yet fully there. And these incentives will be instrumental in propelling the in-orbit servicing industry, both on the side of how those missions can be licensed and facilitated, and how those missions are affected by the market demand and what other operators needs to abide by. Finally, just wanted to highlight a few of the industry forums in which we've been involved recently and that have made published recent guidelines or best practices that are very important. The work of CONFERS in satellite servicing has been very important to set different standards for servicing that are now under review by the AIAA. And so these are real tangible standards from industry that helps develop these servicing capabilities and help address the space debris issue. And I won't talk about the Zero Debris Charter because Tiago will just has summarized all the benefits it brings just before. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Great. Thank you. So this concludes the speaking slots, and we have heard our 5 speakers. And I would say that I paid attention to particularly diversity and the broadness. So we have heard from various actors in the space community already, and we see that there is a lot of efforts and activities going on. The question now is how to move forward at the global level, because this is what the Summit of the Future will be concerned with. Before I have a few questions, but before I turn to those, I would like to see if there are questions from the audience. And I have received one question. It seems that there is only one question so far, and that is a very concrete question. It's from Denise Afonso Ribeiro. And the question goes as follows. Japan is to launch the world's first wooden satellite to combat space pollution. Does ESA have a similar R&D effort? So the question goes to ESA.
Thank you, Niklas. Well, so yes, there is a similar R&D effort going on in Europe. ESA is supporting a project called ESA WoodSat that is actually also having a structure made of plywood. I'm not sure exactly how this is estimated to combat space pollution as such. I think it's more deemed to reduce the pollution you do while producing the satellite. So there may be some misunderstanding there. Even though wood has for sure very interesting properties in impact absorption and so on, but it's not. I think it's more related to the on-ground pollution.
Okay, thank you. Carolina, do we have any other questions posted?
I'm not receiving any more.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, no. So therefore, we'll see if other questions would arise. So I have a general question, and to everyone here actually, and to seek your views if you have any. In the Secretary General policy brief on outer space, which is the basis for all our discussions here, as I said earlier, there is a specific, I would say, recommendation that in the governance framework that the Secretary General proposes with various frameworks that are interlinked, and I mentioned already space traffic management, space debris removal, space resource activities, and obviously space debris mitigation, the whole space debris question is paramount to particularly space traffic management, as we know. There is also there an idea that there could be set up a platform at the COPUS level, a platform for a dialogue with broader operational stakeholder inclusion. And that means that there could be a potential for also having such a platform for a dialogue between governmental representatives and private actors, meaning industry and private sector in this regard, because intergovernmental organizations and non-governmental organizations, international though, they are already within the observer status with COPUS, but private sector attendance is only limited, I would say, to their national delegations. So this would be more of a, I would say, using in a way what ITU has with its sector membership. So my question to you is, do you see this as a potential beneficial way of interacting governments and private operators and operational stakeholders at large at the global level, in the global governance of outer space activities in such an intergovernmental body? Any views from any of the speakers? Do you see this as a potential way forward? Yeah, Aurelie.
Yes. So can you hear me? If I may share my slide. I don't know if it will work. It's not working. Never mind. Yes, I can't manage to share the slide right now, but I had really a graphic. Maybe I can paste it, copy paste, which shows that the whole regime, there is quite a significant body of instrument in space sustainability governance. So we are familiar with the ones that we mentioned today. But indeed, it's really interesting. This, what I mentioned about policy innovation, lies in the involvement of the private actors in actually shaping some new responsible and sustainable behaviors. So best practices, guidelines, quite a number of declarations. And I believe that this really justifies having a new platform under the COPUS, because in my whole study, my whole research on the debris governance especially, it was really important, the role of the COPUS as the platform of exchange, even though the first guidelines, the IEDC guidelines, were shaped by the space agencies outside of the COPUS discussion at first, and then under the special meeting. So definitely, I would have to agree that this sounds like an efficient idea. And the number of instruments in the debris governance regime is a kind of testimony to that idea. So for sure, I would agree.
Okay, thank you. Vini, what do you think?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I agree, which seems a bit biased, as you know, I'm here representing a non-governmental entity such as Astroscale. But we do have some examples, and even the example provided by you, Niklas, of the structure of the ITU. So, for instance, Astroscale is a sector member to the ITU, and we joined the Radio Communication Assembly and the WRC last year as sector members, and there were several inputs that we provided through the administrations that we work with. So, in my case, Ofcom here in the UK. But also, it was extremely beneficial to the end result and what ended up becoming Resolution 74 of the RA, and because of Astroscale's contribution as a sector member. And right now, we are working with several other industry players in preparation for the next study cycle in how the industry can provide inputs to the discussions within the study groups at ITU level. So having a similar platform within UN COPUS, which, you know, we all acknowledge and understand the challenges associated with that and the decision-making process of COPUS. Everything has to be decided by consensus, and the discussions, you know, they can inevitably drag for quite many years. But it is a good step forward in actually having those inputs from industry and I think another example is the charter itself, although voluntary and not legally binding. So working together with other players and ESA and us being able to provide the inputs, and in spite of all the ambitions in having a long-term sustainable uses of space, what the industry can accomplish today and what the industry will be able to accomplish, say, by 2030 and beyond, was extremely relevant in us being able to have that document, the charter, with a set of guiding principles and targets which are attainable and achievable by industry. So it's not just a document that we are happy to have and we're going to put in a shelf and be proud of, but a real document that can be used by industry to become more sustainable. So yeah, essentially
Okay.
that's I think. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Thank you. So Tiago, you wanted to say.
Well, I'll echo a lot what Vini just said, actually, but for sure I see a very important added value of having also the private sector represented in a platform to discuss with the regulators. We see a lot of best practices coming out also of industry. We see industrial progress in this sector as an enabler for any future regulation, and I think it would inform not only the regulation of today, but also where we can go, what we can envisage in the near future. So definitely very much in favor of that.
Okay, good. Thank you. Romain.
And just to add to what's been said, I think one great benefit of this is that private operators have a great experience operating in space, and there's more and more commercial operators, and they're facing risk from derelict objects and decades of space use. So the interaction there's a lot of interaction in space between government-owned objects and commercially owned objects. And having that platform to advance best practices and norms would be helpful.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And obviously we know the challenges. We know all the political issues involved in broadening this. So obviously it's not an easy task, but the reason the Secretary General put this into his report is that the whole Summit of the Future is also to look into modern governance perspectives and really move governance forward. So not only having really a more, or foster, I would say, a dialogue between governments and private sector within the UN system, but also youth contribution and the gender aspect of the various activities. So these are very important pillars of the Summit of the Future, as we know. And I think on the last day of this webinar, there will also be a youth integration. So you will discuss, how that could potentially stimulate modern governance, I would say, or governance for the future. Just to note that I referred to the SG policy brief. There is also a parallel report that was issued, I think last year or late 2022, but within the framework of the preparations of the Summit of the Future, the so-called high-level advisory board to the Secretary General, which was chaired by the former Swedish Prime Minister and former President of Liberia. And they contributed with really looking into more effective governance and multilateralism in the future. And page 21 of that report is dedicated to COPUS, and particularly on a platform for broader operational stakeholder inclusion. So you could check that up, page 21 of a very big report. Any further questions from the audience? Carolina, I don't see. No, there are none. So I think we should wrap up, but I would then conclude by kind of a challenge here. A very big question, though.
Sorry, Niklas, we have a question. I just missed it.
We have a question. Oh, great.
Sorry.
I like when we are interactive.
It's from Anne Viola Marsland. What ways is the European Union as an institution involved in the establishment of new space laws?
Yeah, Vini. European Union.
Yes, so just as a disclaimer, I'm not a member or representing the European Commission or the European Union. This is just my experience as, again, an industry representative in joining the discussions with the Commission. So what the European Union is doing right now is trying to harmonize across the single market all technical requirements in relation to resilience, security, and sustainability. So essentially, ensure that when operators are obtaining their authorizations and their licenses to operate their spacecraft across the European Union, they have to fulfill the same technical standards. So we don't have any sort of fragmentation in relation to those technical standards. There are some difficulties at EU level in how to accomplish that, and to what degree the European Union can harmonize, quote unquote, space laws. So some restrictions that we can find in Article 189 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, etc., and even the mechanisms by which the Commission is going to propose both binding and non-binding mechanisms to work. So it's still a little bit unclear what would be the proposal from Commission that is going to go to Parliament and Council. We don't know if it's going to be a regulation. We don't know if it's going to be a directive. But it seems to be clear that the policy option they're going to follow is one that is going to have both binding instruments and voluntary non-binding instruments. And one of these voluntary non-binding instruments is what is being called as the EU Space Label. And that links to a discussion that we've been having about the abundance of non-legally binding instruments for the mitigation and remediation of space debris, and to what extent the operators are actually either adhering to them and complying with them. So before I conclude, but making a quick reference to Dr. Fatheya's presentation in how the UAE has been approaching this, which is similar to recent instruments and primary legislations and regulations in different states. So here in the UK, we also have principles of sustainability that we have to comply and adhere to. There is a very long list of existing instruments that we have to make reference to. But this is essentially setting the floor. And what we want to do is also raise the ceiling in relation to these requirements and ensure that operators adopt more sustainable practices, but acknowledging at the same time that it might be difficult and costly for a number of operators. So we do require a number of incentives associated with all of that. So yeah, but I will shut up now because I love to hear other people's opinions. But yeah.
We have another question that just came. It is quite an interesting question, actually. Would you support a global fund to pay for active debris removal? So remediation, not mitigation. So a global fund to pay for active debris removal. Would you support that, and how do you see such an effort? Anyone?
Well, I can start, Romain, if you want to go.
Yeah, Romain.
So yeah, of course. I mean, the response is yes. Funding for debris removal, we're all for it. In practice, it's interesting because a lot of people are often mentioning the legal difficulties in removing objects that have been launched by other states, but in practice, a major difficulty is funding for the legacy objects and who is willing to put money on the table to reduce risk. And this is a collective action problem because everyone would benefit from the reduction of risk in orbit. And finding a good way to apportion the cost of remediation among the stakeholders is very difficult. But that would be welcome, and efforts at the international level to try and address the legacy objects and finding ways to apportion that risk, because some are more responsible than others in having created that risk and benefiting from space activities, which parallels other global issues where there's pollution and there's costs to be apportioned among the stakeholders. So of course I would welcome that, but the obstacles are very large.
Yeah. All right, thank you. I think we have Tiago next, yeah?
Yes, I was going to say that I think the issue of funding active debris removal in the future is definitely something that needs to be tackled. I think we'll need again and going in the direction that we have discussed for guidelines and best practice. I think we need a multitude of instruments. To be honest, I don't think there will be one fits all and one serves all. So I think it will be important to imagine not only at international level, but also at national level, even voluntary level, instruments that can support these efforts in the future, as we are doing for other pollution aspects on ground.
Yeah, thank you. Fatheya, please.
Yes, it's as an idea, I think everyone will support it, but in the reality, lots of countries will come and tell you like, why would you want me to pay where I don't even have a satellite there in the space? This is from one perspective. The other perspective are actually the private sector is willing as well to pay. And then there's other government other countries will be with, and the others will be saying no on the opposite side. But what about the private sector? I saw your hand up.
Yeah. No. That's correct. Vini, you wanted to react?
Yeah, just to add to my colleagues' comments. Yeah, it's crucial. It's very important when we talk about ADR, active debris removal. So there are a significant number of what was referred to as the legacy debris. So small or large objects which were left in orbit at a time that we didn't have a full comprehensive understanding of the impact of leaving those objects behind. And also the leadership and initiative of some governments in actually acknowledging their share of responsibility in relation to the problem. So not necessarily at this point a global fund, which is a good idea, taking into consideration also all the difficulties in implementing it, but it must be acknowledged that certain governments are really trying to acknowledge their share of responsibility. So Address J in Japan is being funded by JAXA and is inspecting and aims to remove a Japanese object which was left there. UK ADR is also a good example. So these are two UK registered objects, legacy objects, which were launched several years ago. But it's a combination of a number of things. So there is the role of industry. So companies such as Astroscale, ClearSpace, the Orbit, just to name a few, we are developing the capabilities, the technology. We are supporting the development of policies. We've been very much involved in trying to shape and contribute to the development of this part of the solution. But also on the other side, we need the necessary incentives. We need the necessary either financial or otherwise. And funding, and so it's what Tiago said. Yeah, it's a combination of several different pieces to this puzzle to make sure that we ensure long-term sustainability. So maybe just the global fund in itself wouldn't help, or rather, it would help but not be sufficient. But it could be part of, again, the solution.
Okay, yes, and of course we all acknowledge the challenges, obviously, in this regard. There are, however, such, I would say, global funds in other areas. So in the maritime sector, for instance, oil pollution, etc., there are such mechanisms. So it could be worthwhile looking into that, obviously. Carolina, I don't see any other questions from the audience, and I think we are approaching the end of our time. I said I would ask a challenging, provocative question. I think I don't do that in the end because I want to leave this panel as it is now. I think we have contributed to the overall efforts of this webinar. We have heard that there is a lot of activities going on, particularly in a very emerging field as space debris removal, where we are only at the beginning. But there are activities also across the space community, and we have also exchanged some views on the potential of a future platform for including operational stakeholders into international global governance frameworks such as COSPAR. And we have also discussed, based on the question, thank you for that question, by the way, on the potential of setting up a global fund. But we know the challenges, and also, which was stressed, it's not only the question of a global fund for financing the removal of debris, but it must be part of a multitude of instruments, as was also said, and private sector involvement, which we have focused on here really in our outputs. So Carolina, that was just from my side, and I wish to thank the panelists. Great, and thank you so much for this dialogue. Carolina, over to you.
Thank you so much, dear speakers, for excellently sharing your experience and ideas on this so important and vast topic, from which, and following a bit on what Niklas has just resumed, I have mainly retained the fundamental importance of access to data, the importance of active industry participation in the policy chain and in the drafting of best global practices, norms and guidelines, binding or non-binding, and recognition of the progresses that already have been made in definition and consolidation of public policies in space sustainability, including on space debris. How can public policies in financial matters can also help operators to take the right path? How can national public recommendations and national space law enforce space debris mitigation measures in the authorized space activities, and at which phase of the operation it's aimed to, whilst pursuing the international commitments of states? And how can comprehensive step-by-step approaches aimed to minimize debris, co-developed by a proactive community, can effectively support the technical standards and the common norms towards sustainability? And last but not least, thank you so much, dear Niklas, for your great moderation and for the perfect setting of this symposium with the technical one, leading to the May conference and to the Secretary General Space Policy Brief and the fostering of the Summit of the Future. And so, with this gold key, we conclude the session on space debris and pave the way for the next session on space resources tomorrow already. At 12 UTC tomorrow, Artemis Papathiniou will be moderating another excellent panel on space resources and date-specific challenges with Tanya Mason-Swan, Gerald Sanders, João Zvid, and Thomas Rosinski. Do not miss it. And thank you again to all of you, dear speakers and dear moderator, for your so generous contribution to the Policy Symposium. And to all, a nice morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you might be. See you all tomorrow. Bye-bye.